Hi there. I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I'd like to thank Chris and Andy Gonzalez for alerting me to this amazing story. I'm going to tell the story today of Meliton Gonzalez Trejo. He played a significant role in the gathering of Israel in the latter days. He was a royal Castilian Spaniard who was a direct descendant of the governors appointed by the Romans to rule over Spain. He had blond hair, blue eyes, and fair skin, and was a very slightly built man. In the 1600s, Meliton's uncle was a bishop in Spain and held strong to the Catholic beliefs, while England floundered with the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church was established by Henry VIII. He held firm. Meliton was born into a wealthy, influential family. He was in a position of prominence and became highly educated. His parents sent him to Bordeaux, France, to be educated, and he received a doctorate degree. They had hoped he would follow his uncles and make a career of the church, but he desired to join the military. He was still a deeply religious man. He studied, he prayed, but he never really felt satisfied with the answers he got from the Catholic faith. And one day, one of his fellow officers mentioned a group of saints that had been guided to the Rocky Mountains by a prophet of God. Meliton was struck. He felt deeply in his heart that he wanted to be with those people and meet them and travel to the Rocky Mountains. He determined the best course to accomplish that was for him to be assigned to the Philippines. So he petitioned the Queen of Spain and soon received a position in the Philippines as a military officer. And the work when he got there was consuming. He was soon so involved that he lost focus of what had originally brought him to the Philippines. And then, like the Lord does, he reached out. He struck Meliton with an ailment, and he was hospitalized for an extended period of time. It gave him occasion to ponder and to think about his life, and he was reminded what had brought him to the Philippines in the first place. When he was released from the hospital, he engaged in fervent prayer, and soon he received a vision, a manifestation of what he needed to do. So he concluded his work in the Philippines. He sewed $2,000 in bills into the vest of his suit, and then he traveled to America. He arrived in 1874 on July 4th in San Francisco, and then he made his way toward Salt Lake. While he was traveling, Brigham Young called two men to open the Mexican mission, Elder Daniel Jones and Elder Henry Breezy. They both spoke Spanish, but they didn't have the technical ability to translate from English to Spanish, so they were really struggling. And when Meliton arrived in Salt Lake, he could read English, but he didn't speak English. He decided that he would walk around Salt Lake and see what the city was like. He dressed in his Spanish military uniform of an officer. He had the big tall hat with the red plumage and big bright shoulder pads and a crisscross, big belt with a sword and bright red stripes in this royal blue suit, and he began to walk around, or maybe strut, around Salt Lake City, and he soon attracted considerable attention. For a couple of days, he really couldn't communicate very well with anyone, but then a brother Blanchard, who was a Frenchman, began to talk with him. He invited them to his home, and there they had gospel discussions that led late into the night. And soon Meliton Trejo was baptized a member of the church. Shortly after his baptism, he was introduced to Brigham Young. Brigham Young is the only person that he ever shared the details of his vision. He told him that he had an overwhelming desire to translate the Book of Mormon into Spanish. And I'll bet Brigham Young said, yeah, we've been looking for you. And so he introduced him to the two missionaries, Jones and Breezy, that had been assigned to open Mexico to missionary work. Brother Trejo had some of the money left over from the 2,000 he had traveled with, and so for the next year he used that money to support himself as he translated select passages of the Book of Mormon. He also translated partly P. Pratt's work, A Voice of Warning, and these were published, and Elder Breezy and Elder Jones took them to Mexico City and did an exploratory mission. A year later, Louis Garf and Brother Trejo were assigned to be missionaries in the Mexican mission. And 6 months after their arrival, they had the first members baptized into the LDS Church. Shortly afterwards, Apostle Moses Thatcher was assigned to travel to Mexico City. Elder Trejo and Elder James Stewart went with him, and they dedicated the land of Mexico for the gathering of Israel. They finished their mission, and Elder Stewart and Elder Trejo moved to Logan, and shortly afterwards, Elder Meliton Trejo married Emily Jones, and they started a little farm on the south end of Logan. But he really dedicated himself, as did Brother Stewart, to the translation of the Book of Mormon into Spanish. And finally, in 1886, the work was completed, and the Book of Mormon was published into Spanish. During that time, Trejo became a professor at LDS College, which was on State Street and Social Hall Avenue. It later became the University of Utah. And while he was teaching at the university, he was called as a missionary to help open Colonia Mexico. So he took his 4 children and his wife, and they moved to Juichupa. He started a cattle ranch and began to develop his herd and to work in the church. He would frequently sequester himself in the mountains for days and fast and pray and try to find more about what the Lord wanted him to do. During that time, he became an influential member of the church in the northern states of Chihuahua and Sonora in Mexico. And he met many of the members and many of the friendly Mexicans that were listening to their message. One of the men he met was Doroteo Arango. During that time, there was a great deal of social unrest. President Diaz had reigned with an iron fist and had ground the poor and treated them like peasants, and there was a revolution that was stirring, and soon many of the men of Mexico began to revolt, and there began to be a rapid succession of presidents during this time, this Mexican Revolution. And this young man that he met in one of the saints' homes became one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution. He had the largest, best-trained army in Mexico, and he became known as Pancho Villa, which means free the villages, the Robin Hood of Mexico. The presidencies went by rather quickly. President Diaz was replaced by President Gonzalez. President Gonzalez was replaced by President Madero. President Madero was assassinated. They offered the presidency to Pancho Villa, but he turned it down. He was not a politician, and he offered the job to President Huerta. He was, Pancho Villa thought, his friend and ally. But as soon as he became president, he arrested and imprisoned Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa escaped, but he began to feel that he'd been betrayed. In 1912, the Mexican Revolution had got to a point that all the saints were counseled to leave northern Mexico. And so especially the American saints left Colonia Mexico and returned to New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. A lot of them left all their property. Brother Trejo, with his family, fled to St. David, Arizona. The United States began to really meddle in the affairs, and they unseated President Huerta, and they were able to establish President Carranza as the President of Mexico. At that point, Pancho Villa felt betrayed by his friends, President Huerta and President Carranza, and also by the United States federal government. If you were an American, you were in trouble with Pancho Villa. His men soon began to rule over the northern states of Mexico. and would raid villages, and they decided they would raid the town of Columbus, New Mexico. And it was a disastrous event for Pancho Villa and his men. Many of them were killed. But the United States responded, and they called General Black Jack Pershing, who was a feared military leader, and gave him 50,000 troops to go into northern Mexico and invade it, and look to kill Pancho Villa. The American press said it was like trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer, and they failed in their attempts. During that time, Brother Trejo felt compelled to return to his ranch in Mexico and retrieve the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon and possibly some of his other property, like cattle, for his new ranch in Arizona. And on his journey, he was fired on by the men of Pancho Villa and the other guerrillas. He was fired on by the federal troops of Mexico and by the federal troops of the United States. He convinced all of them that he was a Mexican, that he was a Castilian, and that he owned property in Mexico. The federales took him prisoner. Trejo was forced as their prisoner to teach school. During that time, he was allowed to live at his ranch, and frequently Pancho Villa would seek refuge in his farmhouse. And one morning, Pancho Villa had left very early in the morning. The house was surrounded by federales. They dragged Trejo out of the house and began to torture him and beat him and try to get him to reveal where Pancho Villa had gone. They took large groups of his cattle and just shot him down right in front of him, trying to destroy his property. And finally, they hung him until he was nearly dead. His face turned black. They continued to torture him, and the injuries from that torture plagued him the rest of his life, but he didn't give up the location of his friend, Pancho Villa. A few months later, after serving as a prisoner for 8 months, he was allowed to escape with the aid of some of the Mexican members in northern Mexico, and he returned to his family in St. David, Arizona, where he developed a painful neuropic disorder. He died April 29th, 1917. He had fathered 10 children. He was survived by his wife and 6 of the children. His family in Spain had disowned him when he had joined the church, but one brother had remained friendly with him, and through his brother, he was able to gain the information he needed to do the genealogical research that allowed him to do temple work for his ancestors. Meliton Trejo was an amazing man. He would describe his conversion by saying, "The gospel came to me like this." It just consumed him, and he was dedicated his whole life. He translated the Book of Mormon into Spanish. He was uniquely qualified as a translator, as a missionary to open Mexico to the gathering of Israel, as an emissary, as a colonist, and as a diplomat. And he's largely unrecognized for the substantial contribution he made to gather Israel in the latter days. Today, 35% of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is Spanish-speaking, and Brother Meliton Trejo is largely responsible for that work. During the time that Brother Trejo was ailing, General Pershing failed in his mission to catch Pancho Villa. And as he withdrew, Brother Bert Wetton was the stake president. He returned so that he could shepherd his flocks. The Mexican Revolution was quieting, and he felt like they could get some supplies to some of the missionaries who had been stranded during the Mexican Revolution. He was joined by President E.T. Bentley, who was president of the Mexico Mission, and they loaded a wagon and were traveling throughout northern Mexico trying to take supplies to some of the missionaries. One evening, as they were camped by a spring, they were surrounded by the guerrillas and taken prisoner. It took 3 days in a jail before they convinced the guards to allow them to speak to General Angeles. General Angeles had been solicited by the federal government of the United States to insert himself with Pancho Villa. they had decided to take a more surgical approach to the Pancho Villa problem and had enlisted his help. He was a friend of Pancho Villa and was considered one of the most brilliant military minds in the Mexican Revolution. And as his men came to him and told him these prisoners wanted to talk to them, he came into the jail and listened to them. He confided in President Bentley and President Whetten that he was an operative for the United States government, but made them promise not to tell Pancho Villa. But as they explained the gospel and what their missionary work was all about, he became excited. Finally, he shouted through the door, "Pancho, come here. I want you to hear what these men say. They are doing with words and books what we're trying to do with guns." Pancho Villa sat down to listen, continuing to nod in between the questions he asked. His final question was, "Why have you never told me this before? I have lived around the Mormons all my life, and with the Mormon family for a while in Sonora, but never before have I heard your doctrine explained or learned the real meaning of your way of life. It might have made a difference in my life." At that point, General Angelus became more excited and solemnly exclaimed, "If I ever get out of this mess alive, I'm going to join the Mormons." Pancho Villa looked a little anxious and asked, "I might do the same, but do you have a place for a man like me? No doubt you've heard much about me, most of which is untrue. I've been bad enough, all right, but not as bad as I've been represented to be. Every killing, hold-up, or bank robbery has been blamed on Pancho Villa, and most of them I knew absolutely nothing about. But if I ever get out where it's possible to make proper arrangements, I may do just as General Angelus says he would do." A few days later, President Whetten and President Bentley were released. Shortly afterwards, General Angelus was taken prisoner by the Federales, taken to Mexico City, and he was tried and executed. And at that point, Bert Whetten and President Bentley became consumed with trying to find a way to do his temple work. They could not find any records that referred to his date of birth or where he was born or anything about him, and for years they searched. But one day, after President Bentley returned from General Conference in Salt Lake City, he announced he had done General Angelus's work in the Salt Lake Temple. The First Presidency had told him to go ahead, even if they lacked the essential data. President Bentley died shortly after that, and Bert Whetten let the matter drop. But as time passed, he was able to spend time in the temple, and he became curious to see what had been recorded of the work done for Filipe Angelus. To his surprise, he could find no one that knew anything about it or any record of the work. President Whetten became obsessed with trying to get General Angelus's work done and trying to find the information that would allow them to do that in the temple. A couple of years later, one of his sons was in Mexico conducting some business and mentioned to an attorney their desire to find out more about General Angelus. The attorney said, "I have a legal book that has the transcript of his trial. Maybe there's some information in there for you." So he gave him this legal book, and as they investigated, they saw that when he was allowed to testify, he began his testimony by saying where and when he was born and the names of his parents. So he went to the temple and he did Brother Angelus's temple work. 50 years later, 5 decades, in the middle of the night, Bert Whetten woke from a sound sleep and was astonished to see Pancho Villa standing above the ground at the foot of his bed. Pancho seemed very sad and asked for Elder Whetten's help. He said, "There's a beautiful city where everything is perfect. I've tried and tried to get in, but they say I can't get in without your help." Elder Whetten, understanding what he was referring to, said, "Well, President Bentley's on the other side of the bell with you. He can help you." But Pancho said, "No, they said he can't help me. Only you can help me. You're on the earth and can do the work. Elder Wetton responded, "Okay, I'll do what I can." Elder Wetton sat up in bed, and he awakened his wife, who asked in concern, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I've been talking to Pancho Villa." "Oh, you're just dreaming it," she laughed soothingly. He said, "No, he was standing there at the foot of the bed. Didn't you see him?" And she said, "Of course I didn't see him." She laughed again. "You've just eaten too much dinner." The dream had so shaken Brother Wetton that he couldn't sleep much the rest of the night, nor could he get it off his mind the rest of the day. He kept asking himself why he had not been on the search for Pancho Villa's genealogy while he was hunting so diligently for that of General Angelus. Though Pancho Villa had not been as vehement about his desire to join the church as Angelus, both he and President Bentley felt sure that if conditions were right, he would eventually join. He now decided to do what he should have done earlier. Miraculously again, he found a friend with a book containing all they needed. In this book, he not only found all the information necessary, but also learned that Pancho Villa was Doroteo Arango. He copied it onto a sheet and took it to Pancho Villa's widow in Chihuahua City to verify its accuracy, and then explained what he hoped to do with it. To his surprise, she not only agreed, but asked what he could do for her. He said, "I will send you the missionaries, and you can do it for yourself." And this she promised to do. Wetton made a duplicate of his sheets and sent it to the first presidency, who in turn said that Pancho Villa's work should be done as well. President Joseph Fielding Smith commissioned Bert Wetton to do Pancho Villa's temple work. Brother Wetton later traveled to Mesa, Arizona, the nearest temple, and announced to the temple president, "I'm here to do temple work for Pancho Villa." The temple president was astonished and strongly resisted, saying, "No, you can't do that. He was a notoriously bad man. We don't do temple work for people like that." When Elder Wetton heard that, he got a big smile on his face and said, "I thought you might say that." He then took out a letter he had obtained from the first presidency, directing him to do Pancho Villa's work. He was perhaps the only one alive who had the knowledge to convince the first presidency of Pancho Villa's inner workings. That day, Bert Wetton did temple work for Doroteo Arango, a.k.a. Pancho Villa, the Robin Hood of Mexico, a selfless act of service and love. Just as a side note, before Bert Wetton did the temple work in the early 1960s, Pancho Villa was considered a villain and an outlaw throughout the world as well as in Mexico. After that time, however, something changed, and historians and the Mexican Secretary of Education began writing about him as a great liberator. Now he is considered a hero in Mexico. I loved that story. Many of us hear things and believe things about other people. Gossip and false information on the news causes us to develop opinions. And Satan does the same thing with us. Satan tries to convince us that the Lord is done with us, that we've just done too many things to return to the covenant path. But the Lord loves you. He wants you to join him in that glorious city in the house of Israel, and will allow you to change and will guide your life. No matter what you've done, consider approaching our Savior Jesus Christ. Take his burden on you, and he will take your burden on him. He will guide and direct your life and will allow you to find a path that leads to happiness and joy in eternity. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. I was thrilled to find out this information. It's such a great story. I frequently say this one should be a movie, but this one combined with the vision of fire that Pancho Villa had, they could make a great movie out of that. And I love telling the story. If you've enjoyed this story, you probably will enjoy this one. And if you enjoy these stories, you'd probably enjoy all of Sunshine for the Soul inspirational stories. Thank you for watching.